Thank you so much for being here. Thanks for the Times Lit Fest for hosting us, and welcome to our speakers. Our topic today is Civilization Rides the Rivers. When we think of the history of human settlement, when we think of large numbers of people building all kinds of things and writing and and just developing complex systems, we are taken back to Mesopotamia, to Egypt, to India and Pakistan along the Indus, and of course to China. So I think it's a really wonderful time to have a revisit. Where do we stand today as we, and as we compare ourselves to these histories, and which was so seminally associated with rivers. So I'm going to start with the longest river, arguably the longest river. I'll start with you, Ahdaf, the Nile. Yeah, what makes Nile such, in your opinion, an iconic river for human civilization?
Well, I guess obviously the ancient civilization which flourished along its banks and which would never have happened without it. I mean, there's the famous saying by Herodotus, Egypt is the gift of the Nile, and that is actually a little bit controversial now because the people were also very active, of course. I mean, it was the mix or the cooperation between the river and the geography and the inhabitants. So I guess, yeah, there is, and then there's a romance attached to it, I think, because certainly in Egypt and for a little way further south, it's a very lonely river. It's in the biggest desert landmass in the world. And when you see it, obviously when you see it on a map, but also when you see it in these satellite images or when you see it from a plane, it looks so fragile, and life clings to it like a sort of rope thrown across the desert. So there is a terrific romance about it, I think.
Anthony, talk about the Ganga and why you think it's so iconic. Yeah.
Sure. So I think that Ganga is so iconic for quite a few reasons, but probably I think one of the most is that it's this really kind of significant axial river across northern India. So just geographically, it's quite significant in terms of its size, in terms of the water that passes through it. Of course, also it figures so prominently in the Ramayana, Mahabharata. It's not only something that I think has come to define so much of the Indian subcontinent and the civilizations and religions that are within it, but you find from the Greeks, from Dante, the way in which the Ganges figures, or the Ganga figures quite prominently for many people outside of the sphere of the subcontinent as well, as such a major river in terms of where Alexander's campaign ends, going from Europe all the way to Asia. So I think it has so many layers and so many levels of significance, and then especially today, because it is the most densely populated river basin in the world. It has over 500 million people living within it. It's monsoonal and still agriculturally productive. So it's an incredibly layered, complex, sacred geography, human geography, social and political space that I think all of those layers add to its kind of iconic nature.
Moin, you are in some ways not looking at a river that is, when you describe the work that you do, it's almost like you are reminding us, you are not dealing with a river that has, taken over the national imagination. In fact, it's a forgotten, if we might argue, as a symbol, it's almost forgotten. As an economic mainstay, it's almost forgotten. And so you're, in some ways, the work that you do, or the engagement with the river Tapti, is a way, are you trying to, re-establish its iconic nature and its importance in history? So tell us more about that.
Well, the Tapti, as you rightly pointed out, Ravina, is a forgotten river in many ways. And it's quite tragic because the Tapti did something which probably no other river in India quite did, which was it gave life to a city called Surat, which went on to become Mughal India's greatest port. And the Dutch historian Tapestry, when he saw the Tapti, said that because of its majestic position, right next to the Arabian Sea, because it opens out into the Arabian Sea, Surat was able to flourish and become one of the, not just India's, but that entire Persian belt's greatest port. It was a magnet, Surat, because it attracted a vast array of merchants, Jews, Turks, Chalabi Turks, Armenians, Jains, Hindus, Muslims, all of them trading on the banks of the river Tapti. And you can imagine what an incredible city Surat must have been back in the 17th, right till the very early 19th century. In fact, when the Flemish actually arrived at the banks of the Tapti and they saw the quality of shipbuilding that was taking place right there on the banks, they thought the quality of shipbuilding that was emerging out of India was even better than Europe. So that was what Tapti did. It gave us Surat. But it also had, as Ahdaf says, a romantic angle to it. As the Tapti flows, it also had smaller boats that went upstream, and it gave life to a new city there called Burhanpur. And the Mughals would use those little boats to get their mint across all of India. So if it wasn't for the Tapti, the distribution of coins would have been a massive problem for the Mughals. Also, Burhanpur, which is on the banks of the Tapti, romantically, was the place where Mumtaz Mahal dies. And Shah Jahan takes this great oath that he's going to build her the Taj Mahal. So the Taj Mahal, the promise to build the Taj Mahal happens on the banks of the Tapti.
Wow.
That's nice.
So that's wonderful. How did you get interested in the Tapti? Did you grow up around there? Did you, yeah?
Well, my family's origins are from Surat, so as a child I was taken there by my grandmother, and I have to be honest, I was alarmed to see the state of the Tapti even back then, which is about 20 years ago. A deluge of plastic instead of dramatic waves, if you wish. And so that image stuck with me. But I have to give, it's fascinating what's happened now, because the government of Gujarat has just restored the castle, which was this imposing structure on the banks of the Tapti that stood, boldly as Hindustan's symbol of maritime trade. And as a result of the restoration of that castle, there's renewed interest in the Tapti. And, people are flocking there. And hopefully, well, if it doesn't necessarily re-emerge as a prominent river, at least there will be interest in the river again.
So a moment for you when you wanted to write about this river and engage with it was looking at its devastation and looking at some of its challenges. Anthony, what made you choose the Ganga, from all the way from the US?
Well, so one of the things that really struck me and what drew me to the Ganga was that I had lived along the Mississippi River in New Orleans, along the Tiber in Rome, Italy, and so developed a kind of romance for rivers and cities. And I knew that I wanted to devote quite a bit of time to the study of a kind of river basin. And so I looked at the Nile, I looked at the Ganga, I looked at the Amazon, and what struck me was that the Ganga was the most densely populated river basin, agriculturally productive, and monsoonal, and it hadn't been mapped in over half a century. So I wrote a Fulbright proposal to actually come to map the Ganga, and it was at a time pre-Google Earth, so I literally had to walk the length of the river, and I really thought it would just take me a year to do, but instead it took me a decade to develop new ways of visualizing the choreography of the monsoons and their deep rhythms and how they shape not just agriculture, but cities and life all throughout the basin. So it was really a kind of project of its opacity, or what little I could find out about it is what drew me to it and continues to draw me to it.
And you still live in Cairo, where the Nile flows, and unlike Moin and Anthony, who are away from the rivers that are the subjects of their latest books. But Ahdaf, how does the Nile figure in your writing, and how do you encounter it? What are the ways in which you remember it?
Well, okay, these are big questions. I think when you live with something, even if it is the Nile or the pyramids or the desert or whatever, you take it for granted, and it's not something you particularly think about. And I grew up with the river, of course, and it was only when I went to England to study, that I realized that I missed it. I missed it as I missed the sunshine and as I missed my grandparents. It was a personal missing. And I've spent about 3 decades going from London to Cairo and back. And very early on, it became clear that I went back maybe twice a year. And going from the airport, you took a highway into town, and at a certain point, you saw the river. Suddenly you were practically on the river, and on the river in a spot in the heart of Cairo where there are some little pleasure boats lit up, going around on it, and that was the moment when I would feel I had come home. So that was pretty intense. I have not really particularly written about it, except again as a locale, as if things are happening in Cairo, then the river is part of it. But at the moment, I think for me the thing that is kind of like happening in my head is the river as a metaphor for where we have got to. In other words, this amazing, life-giving, civilization-building river that drew people together and that drew bounty from the earth is dying, essentially. And it's dying it's dying through the actions of man, whether that is because of sort of climate change and what it's doing to evaporation and salination and so on, or whether it's because of the mismanagement of rubbish and waste disposal, or what I mean. This is a big topic, but basically the river is drying up and choking. And at the same time, the Egyptian government is very interested in getting people off the best bits of the banks and selling them off to the Gulf. So it's quite a complex metaphor, but I think it can work.
Yeah, I'm reminded about a poem, actually, that a dear friend of mine, the late Aga Shahid Ali, wrote. Where he wrote a poem called Postcard from Kashmir, and he was, of course, Kashmir is on the banks of the Jhelum, which is a tributary of the Indus. It's the river system I know best from my work in Ladakh. And he wrote, when I return, because he lived in the US, when I return, the colors won't be so brilliant. The Jhelum water's so clean, so ultramarine, my love so overexposed. So, yeah, so staying with that, the memory of the river, almost that, as you said, you take for granted, and then a sudden moment, or in your case, another river, and and thinking about its majestic sweep. That perhaps is not something that you do every day, and I think for those of us who live in Mumbai, with the sea around us, we also take it as the backdrop until there's a calamity or there is a significant, nostalgia for every photograph or every picture that we have in our mind, suddenly you realize that that's the common thread that was there in the background, and perhaps I am shaped by that water body. So talking about the Jhelum waters and their cleanliness, and since you both have brought up, the issue of pollution and garbage, Moin, you have brought that up as well. We know that, cleaning up the Ganga, of course, we hear a lot about that, is a very major kind of point of action and intervention by the government. And there's a lot of, there's an alarm. We think of civilization riding the river, but we almost have this panic of being in a very uncivilized moment, right? Where unlike the beauty and the splendor of these civilizations in some ways that we romanticize when we think of history, that settled on riverbanks. Now when we think, shall I settle on the riverbank, you feel a tremendous guilt if you think about waste and if you think about pollution. So could you comment on just the aspect of pollution? Ahdaf, you talked about the drying Nile, where the waters are literally, the fear in Egypt perhaps is about that, the drying of the Nile and that its waters are getting scarce.
I should just clarify that I'm speaking about the Nile in Egypt, because the Nile further south is in a different situation.
Yeah, the Nile, of course, we know that is part of 11 countries, right? Yeah. Do you want to talk about, does anybody want to address, water pollution? Do you want to address garbage? Do you want to address any of that in your work or in what you think about the rivers? Yeah.
I was at the British Museum some time back, and there were a few pieces of the Indus Valley civilization that I was just spending time browsing, and I was really disturbed when I read later on that, and I didn't know this, so excuse my ignorance when I say this, that one of the key reasons for the Indus Valley civilization floundering and then disappearing was the drying up of the Saraswati river. And it changed course, and then eventually it dried up. And as a result, one of the theories is that because of that, the Indus Valley civilization kind of began its slow progress to death, if you wish. But I'd just like to talk a little bit about the Tapti, because I've seen it as a child in probably the most pathetic state. There was always this question that Swali, which was the port not far from Surat, was facing silting, and not much was done to prevent the silting from happening, and therefore, Swali didn't kind of make it as a port. But even the Tapti, the amount of plastic that was there, when I remember seeing that as a child, even when you see it now, it's pretty much the same. And I think the only way one can truly kind of champion that cause is awareness, but I'm sure that's been spoken about many times, and empowerment. Getting the young and getting the next generation, so to speak, for championing and being the torchbearer for these causes. And I can speak about England primarily because that's where I live. There is such a deep-rooted consciousness about the environment. There's a person called Luke Douglas Hume who has started this program called Clear Public Spaces, and it's all about cleaning up rivers in Romania, cleaning up rivers in Britain, and there is there's a complete how would you put it? A network that spreads, which then talks about tourism, creating employment, and that's how people get involved in it. I think what the government has done with the Sabarmati in Ahmedabad is quite brilliant, and if that was kind of replicated for the Tapti, you might have a certain resurgence of interest in the river.
Anthony, what do you think?
Well, I think that Ganga is oftentimes spoken about as being one of the world's most polluted rivers, a dying river, etc. And there have been any number of proposals, plans from the Ganga Action Plan onward in terms of addressing issues of cleaning and pollution entering the river. But I actually, in the work that I do, kind of take a step back and say that before we can really even start to talk about and address issues of pollution, we have to, I think, draw the river differently. So I think a lot of times the way that rivers are drawn is just like two parallel lines with water running through it. But in a monsoonal landscape, like the Ganga Basin, the river can not only shift course, but expands and contracts significantly every year by several kilometers, even in places like western Uttar Pradesh. So I think part of addressing issues of pollution and better understanding people's relationship to it is having drawings that can then inform the way that we describe these spaces, because if we don't have drawings for such a densely populated river basin, it's very difficult to address the fact that there's so much urban growth that's happening along these areas, all of the nalas where most of the wastewater enters the river basin. We need to have drawings that then show how these rivers are shifting in their relationship to groundwater and other surface water bodies. So I tend to think that one of the first steps in order to address these issues is really how do you go about drawing and visualizing it and not seeing the way that people live along the banks and the river as being separate, but really how are they both kind of co-authoring this space. And then you can start to then, I think, address many of the most pressing issues that face the river, not just economically and in terms of pollution, but also the fact that for so many people it's a sacred river. And so how do you then address the issues of the sacred geography and incorporate that in the larger initiatives going forward? And I think that whereas the Sabarmati has been really turned into a giant swimming pool where water is being pumped in, and that's in so many ways that kind of canalization or treating a river like plumbing, coming from the United States, we've done so much of that with the Army Corps of Engineers that I think the Ganga, because of its expansion and contraction, offers a very different model of how do you live with rivers as opposed to kind of creating such a hard line between them. So I see it as if we can develop smarter ways of engaging the river building on the ways that people already do, that it's a model that other parts of the world could try to look to and replicate, as opposed to bringing in these models from abroad that have no relationship to a monsoonal river basin. So to me, that's the hope of developing a new set of drawings or a new way of visualizing this landscape.
Yeah, I mean, when you looked at the history of the engineering of the, and looking at the visualization of the Ganges even by engineers, you found a huge gap, like a 50-year-old gap, right, that you were trying to address. When you, in the type of writing you do, Ahdaf, when you write fiction, you write, non-fiction, where are some of the metaphors of the Nile or the writings of the Nile that inspire you?
Well, again, I mean, again, it's sort of so prevalent for example, I remember when I was a child and we first had television. Of course, everything was very slow on television, and this is in the mid-60s. And a lot of the time you had sort of placeholders, just cards with a picture on them and it was always the river, always it was the river. So the river was sort of almost used to punctuate life, as it were. So, yeah, so I can hardly point to any one specific thing, except there is one poem by Hassan Talib, which is about 20 years old now, which made a big noise because it starts with La Nil illa an-Nil. There is no Nile but the Nile. And that, of course, is a play on La ilaha illallah, there is no God but God, which is the Muslim. So it's like a very sort of big, in-your-face statement. But really, I think that for me, when I think of the Nile in metaphoric terms, it's either in terms of the creation of the world and as it was depicted or thought about in ancient Egyptian times, which is really interesting and really rich, and where they really expressed their relationship with the Nile, or it's in terms of what is happening to it now as a kind of shorthand. Is that me? Am I doing this somehow?
I'm not sure.
No, I don't think so.
What's causing
When I
it.
put my hand down here? No. Okay. In terms of what's happening to the world or what's happening to Egypt.
In your writing, when you talk about the movements for democracy, so I'm going to shift gear a little bit from the environmental kind of aspects of of the rivers to looking at some of the socio-cultural, aspects of the river and people who, and communities that live along the river. So when you talk about that, when I was reading your writing about describing the movement to Tahrir Square and crossing the bridge, it was really, really wonderful to think about this movement of people, and this movement of democracy along the banks of the Nile, crossing to the other side.
Well, Tahrir Square is on the river, and therefore, and of course, on the 25th and again on the 28th of January 2011, the great movements of people came from, I think we've counted seven great protest movements from across the city, and. 4 of them came from the other side of the river in Cairo, and so getting across the river was obviously a big issue, because in Tahrir was where the police forces, the central security forces, took up their position, and so probably one of the most iconic battles of the 28th, and I was there, but I was in the back. I was actually on the bridge. Was the Battle of Asr al-Nil Bridge, where people crossed onto the island of Zamalek and then tried to cross again on Qasr al-Nil Bridge and were met by the police in Tahrir. And that was a battle that lasted all day, where you can imagine that people at the front were engaging and dying, and people at the back didn't know what was going on, but knew they had to stay there and knew they had to keep inching forward. And the images that we have from that are of course amazing. And there are also the images throughout the 18 days of when the police threw gas canisters or any fire things at people, and they picked them up and threw them. At the beginning, they used to throw them into the river. I mean, the protesters lobbing back the gas canisters or the little grenades would throw them into the river. Later on, they threw them back at the police and at the army. But at the beginning, it had this effect of that the river was dotted with little sort of bits of flame or bits of smoke. So it was really taking part in what was happening. Yeah.
Eliot wrote that, I remember a poem from a text that we all had to read in school, the 4 quartets. I think we read it in our, standard BA reading if you did literature. And he wrote that, I do not know much about gods, but I think the river is a strong brown god, sullen, I think it was sullen, untamed, intractable. Have our gods drowned out the rivers? So I'm going to start with you. I mean, you talk about Surat, you talk about the Tapti Bank as an incredibly diverse place culturally, where all kinds of, there's Turkish happening, Urdu, the Parsis, the Jews, the Hindus, the Sufis, your own heritage, know. So how do you think the rivers and the banks around them sustain this kind of diverse richness today?
I think they still do, to a very large extent today. But I just want to take a little step back in terms of metaphors, because I thought that was really interesting. The river Volga runs down into the Caspian. And the only reason I'm bringing this up is because while a river, while you can have an immense amount of romance attached to a river and civilization thrives around it, this is a really interesting example. So the river Volga, runs down through the Caucasus and into the Caspian, and the Vikings made their way down, pillaging everything that came in their way, and a large number of people who would be captured would then be sold off at the port that they would actually come down to in the Caspian. And that's how the slave trade actually started. The word slave comes from the Slavs that were actually defeated by the Vikings. So that river, the Volga River, actually became a dreaded river for the Slavs. They would actually dread the ships of the Vikings that would come down to pillage their little villages and sell them off. On the other hand, you had the Tapti, which became, Leo Tolstoy wrote about the cafes that dotted the Tapti and said that the cafes here, around Surat that dot the Tapti River are probably even better than the ones in Venice. So, a river has so many different ways of meaning different things to people. The Slavs dreaded the Volga. The multicultural ethnicity of Surat thrived with the Tapti. But coming back to your question, which is more specific to today, I think it still does, even from a modern perspective. If you look at, if let's just broaden it up a little bit, from a river, but let's look at the Bosphorus, which is a little bit larger than a river, a tiny little sea. But look at the Bosphorus, over the last many years. It's a thriving place. Everything that is around the Bosphorus is symbolic of progress, is symbolic of modernity, is symbolic of culture, is symbolic of the intermingling of faiths, intermingling of people. And so I think a river, even today, captures that spirit. Don't go very far. Even the Narmada today, there are pockets where, if you, particularly in Gujarat, you'll have parts of it which have Sufi shrines because the Sufis loved the Narmada, and right next to them you have temples. So the river, in many ways, even today, brings back. It becomes a confluence point for people of different faiths, of different cultures, and that's what it's done for centuries.
Yeah, I want to know more about the Nile in that context.
Well, I think it may have been like that in, certainly until the end of the 19th century. The port of Cairo was on the river, and big boats used to come in through the Mediterranean and dock in Cairo at Boulaq. And that was where rich Europeans went, for example, to hire a boat that would take them up the river, that trip that everybody made for the sunshine and for their health and so on, to Luxor. And of course, again, in pharaonic times, it was a trading river because goods were sailed up it and then carried across the desert to the Red Sea, where they would come over, of course, to India and trade here. Again, when I was growing up, there were like gardens, public parks on the sides of the river, or there were what we called casinos, which were really just cafes where people could sit and have a tea or a sort of Coca-Cola or something. Now, really, for people in Cairo to access the river, they have to stand on the bridges, and in the summer you get many people standing on the bridges because it's where you get some breeze and some air, or they have to buy a ticket for one of the boats that go up and down making loud music. And I don't know about diversity. I don't think that there are lots of different cultures and languages, but one thing that is interesting is, again, for me, everything is going to go back to the revolution, 2011, sorry. But again, in 2011, a particular type of music kind of suddenly came to everybody's consciousness, and it's called mahragan, which means carnival. But it's called mahragan music, and it's music from the streets, and it was in like the back streets, and it was obviously live and popular. And 2011 brought it out to the front where people like me could access it. And it became like really, really the top form of music, and is still very, very popular and very listened to. It's never broadcast on the radio or on television. It is just in the street. And one of the essential ways in which it was transmitted was on these same pleasure boats, because they only played that. And people, for a breath of air, they'd pay £3, get a ticket, and go on a boat that went round for half an hour. And that was the music that was pumping out on the river and in the heart of the city from 2011 onwards.
Wow. Is the Nile, I mean, you talk about, when you think about the Nile and you think about the diversity aspect of it, is there a Pan-African sense that you feel when you look at the Nile, not you personally, but in you know, Egyptian newspapers, or when you're thinking of a broader you know, entity that is Africa, and you think of a broader sweep, you know, of belonging? Is it mostly national, or is there, you know, yeah?
It used to be this broader sweep of belonging. Of course, again, when I was a child, we used to study the river valley, all the countries that were along it, and it was very much a part of Egyptian identity and of Egyptian political strategy to have strong relationships with the countries along the Nile basin. And so that was very, very much part of what one grew up with. And one of the things that were very much held against Mubarak by progressives was that he allowed the relationship with African countries to deteriorate very badly. And in fact, he turned, I mean, the government, the state of Egypt, more or less turned its back on Africa in the late 20th century. And of course, that paved the way, or left the way open for other interests to make their way into the Nile basin. And we see the fruition of that in a project like the Ethiopia Dam, which is going to stop a lot of Egypt's water coming through, and which, you know, obviously could have been negotiated. I mean, you know, we had kind of communal projects. This is all in the days of Nasser, Nehru, socialism, and so on. And again, interestingly, one of the very first initiatives after January 2011 was two people's delegations set out for Ethiopia and further to re-establish contact, to say, you know, we're sorry for the way Egypt has behaved over the last 2 decades, and we would like to be friends and neighbors again. And they were very warmly received, and they were told that, you know, for the sake of the old days and for the sake of Nasser and for the old projects, yes, you are welcome. And that was turned back again, first when the Muslim Brotherhood took power, and then when the army took power. So we're back in a sort of collision and, you know, unfriendly course.
You know, talking about, you know, there's the transboundary, you know, just like I asked Ahdaf, Anthony, the Ganges, of course, is, you know, flows across a large landscape. And, you know, both within India and, you know, into Bangladesh, of course. So what have some of the, and as Moin reminds us, a river and a river shore or a valley could be a locus for enslavement and conquest, but it can also, or it could be one to nurture and to sustain a diverse group of people. We, in some ways, you know, have a responsibility to make it what it is. So, how do you look at the Ganga? what have been some of the very heartening moments for you on the Ganga? You know, when you think of this issue of just diverse kinds of people who inhabit, you know, its shores or who draw from its waters or who are inspired by them. If you think about India or Bangladesh, if you think of it as a, you know, international river, what are some of the positive moments or the connecting aspects of the Ganga that you can think of?
Well, there are so many that it's hard to choose, but I suppose probably one of the most impressive kind of, not moments, but kind of set of moments for me was living in the city of Allahabad, where the Ganga and the Jamuna rivers meet, and then the Saraswati is said to be flowing underground there. And not only can you quite literally see these two rivers that meet, the Yamuna and Ganga, so the brown waters of the Ganga, the azure waters of the Yamuna, but of course, the Kumbh Mela happens there every 12 to 13 years, the Ard Kumbh and Magh Mela happening every year. And what's amazing about that is that this temporary city is built at the confluence of these two rivers, January, February. Roads are laid out, a gridded tent city is put in place. And while that always attracts a lot of media attention, to me what's quite amazing is that this is, you know, pre-monsoon, this festival happens, but after the festival occurs, the tents are pulled up, the roads are pulled up, but the imprint of the city grid remains, and farmers move in and actually use what used to be this densely populated city for agriculture. And it's one of the most intelligent uses that I've ever seen of a river basin being used, from going from hyper-urban to being agricultural and bucolic. And so it's this incredible cycle that happens every year where, and because the sandbars are completely different, the roadways are completely different, but there's a way in which the city literally draws the agricultural plots. Farmers harvest their crops, and then the entire area gets flooded by the monsoons and washes all of the sandbars and temporary housing away. And this kind of slow motion change, I think, speaks a lot to the way, the intelligence that exists in India in monsoonal river basins in terms of how people take advantage of these rhythms of the monsoon, that if they're not drawn and written about, then there's no way, I think, to build upon that. And so for me, that's one of the kind of most intelligent things that I've ever witnessed as an architect and as a historian of how people use space. And Allahabad is really just a kind of microcosm of what happens all throughout the basin. So when I was just in Bangladesh this past summer, I also witnessed not so much a kind of set of religious festivals, but the ways in which people really incorporate the monsoons that I think moves across the entire Ganga River basin. That is really quite extraordinary. So for me, that's one of the most kind of resilient ways in which I think people live within the basin that, to me, still just always is quite astounding.
When you think, you've commented a couple of times on drawing the river. So when you think of, you know, Allahabad today, and if you think of all the name change happening, and you think of a claim to a city on the banks of the, where the, you know, the confluences that you value so much, how do other communities, and given that Ganga has become, you know, so synonymous in political discourse, at least, of one religion, how do other communities feel a claim on the river, or do they?
I would say that one of the things that really has changed people's relationship to the river Ganga was the introduction of not only railways, but also the national highway system and the repaving of the Grand Trunk Road, where the Ganga up to Allahabad used to really be a major transportation corridor. But with rail and roadways, it really shifted, and that became kind of the backside of development. So I would say that there's many farmers of different religions, and certainly also people who live along the banks of the river in cities that have very different relationships with it. I think one of the most fascinating things for me going along the Ganga was the way in which as an architect, you actually see mosques changing their typology, meaning that the way they're structured, they actually, further down river you go, they actually have ghats that lead down or up, right? So lead from the mosque down to the river. That there are ways in which, you know, I think we don't usually typically think of a mosque as being an architectural typology that would do that, but there are ways in which the river kind of, I think, the way in which people kind of incorporate the river into their daily lives, other than Hindus, that I think is quite telling, and shows that the river Ganga is not just a kind of Hindu river, right? That it's that it supports life and shapes it beyond just one group of people.
I'm just going to have one comment about when you imagine the river going back to the Tapti, or going back to wherever you are, and you imagine a river body, and you imagine your next book. What would you like to see of the Tapti, or how would you like it written about 100 years later? You know, so I'm going to ask you that, Moin, and I'm just going to ask one as a way of just asking you to, capture one hope for the river in some ways. Yeah.
I think for me, when I started writing my book, Surat, what struck me was the complete lack of awareness about what the Tapti symbolized. Yes, people knew that it's a river that flows through Surat, and yes, Surat was a port. But there was a complete lack of understanding of what it actually meant. It was, Ravina, it actually was the spine of Indian maritime trade. It created Surat. It was the port of call for Hindustan's might, if you wish, as a seafaring, as a sea trading nation, and that was lost. And almost petered out. So to answer your question as to what I would like, to start with, I would at least like people to be aware of what the Tapti was, what it was and its glory days. And through that, if there is a certain sense, and through that narrative, if one can evoke a certain sense of rekindling a desire to make the Tapti relevant today, and I don't know in what possible way, but if there could be, I would be quite happy if that was accomplished.
Yeah, and for you?
Well, I guess, I mean, the river, as everyone knows, it flows south to north, and then it opens up into the delta, and then it flows into the Mediterranean. And the delta is one of the largest deltas in the world, and about over 50% of Egypt's population live in it, more than 50, probably 60% now. And it's probably the first engineered irrigation system in the world. So all the canals, bigger and smaller ones, that take water from the river and feed it into the different areas. It's a sort of ancient and sort of miraculous network. And it's clogged up, and every sort of little community only sees its own little bit of it, whereas it's a full organic whole. And I think that if we managed to clear the canals in the delta, that would make a huge contribution.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, Anthony, you also talked about the silos, between looking at the urbanization and then you're looking at the farmers' action. And then actually there has to be a rural-urban, way of thinking that is integrated and not, separated when we think of managing the river or engaging with the river. Your own work is carrying you to the delta, right? Like Ahdaf talked about. You want to talk a little bit about that? How will you continue to be with the Ganga? Will you will it be harder now that the book is written, the exhibition is done? Will you be able to come back and engage with it?
Well, so one of the things that I'm working on now is actually looking at the larger Bay of Bengal and the Delta, and really looking not at the rivers, the Brahmaputra, the Ganga, as being just about the movement and carrying of water, but the fact that it's really the largest movement every year of soil on the planet. So the way in which these waters also bring, and to speak about waters in the plural instead of in the singular, that all of the silt that comes through these areas and the choreography of that silt. So I'm looking more at the ways in which kind of longue durée, 50 million years ago, the subcontinent runs into the Asian continent, and when these two, kind of bodies meet, the kind of crimping and crinkling up to form the Himalayas, and over 50 million years and many more monsoons, the ways in which all of that silt has been brought down to support so much agriculture, so much groundwater extraction with tube wells and bore wells, that looking at then how the river basin extends well beyond just, again, this idea of two lines with water running through it. If anything, I see the Ganges as being a river without banks. So trying to think about and wrap my head around and hallucinate more about what does it mean to think about a river without banks, and how far does the Ganga extend and enter the groundwater table level. So that's some of the work that now I'm doing in terms of kind of continuing the book. I just hope that it doesn't take me a decade to do that work as well.
Well, we'd like you to come back for another decade, so I hope it does. Thank you so much for engaging with me, and I'm trying, it was actually, we didn't know each other in that sense, and I don't know if you all knew each other, but I think there's a real passion for the work on water, and whether it's in the foreground or on the background. And I think, I hope that people will read this work and engage with it more. Who wants to ask a question?
Hi, I am Muhammad Wajiuddin from the Times of India, and a great friend of Moin. We are seeing each other after 20 years. Now, when we talk about the rivers, in our country we have the tendency of naming everything. Like cows have a religion, buffaloes have a religion, so Ganga has a religion. Now, when celebrating Ganga, it's not that the one religion has celebrated, but this country's culture is multicultural, you all know. The poet Allama Iqbal celebrates Ganga and says that, "Hey, Abrood Ganga, wo din hai yaad tujhko, utra tere kinare jab karwa hamara." For those who don't understand Urdu, he says that, "Oh River Ganga, do you remember that our caravans came here and settled here?" When he talks about the caravans, he talks about the Muslim caravans who came from different country and settled here down. Now my question to Moin is that, Moin, when I was in Burhanpur, I heard this fascinating story that initially Shah Jahan wanted to build Taj Mahal in Burhanpur on the bank of the Tapti. And till this day, the people in Burhanpur are very disappointed that it didn't happen. And the reason he shifted it to Yamuna, that some people told him that perhaps the climate would not suit this edifice or this monument. What is your research? Have you done any research on this?
Thank you, Mohammed, and it's wonderful to see you after 20 years. Thank you for reminding me. The fact is that Mumtaz Mahal died in the Shahi Qila, which overlooks the Tapti. And the fact also is that Shah Jahan had resolved to build the Taj Mahal on the banks of the Tapti. The site is still very much there. And if you visit, you can see the site there. People even say that Mumtaz Mahal was buried in Burhanpur near the Tapti temporarily, and her remains at a later stage were taken and put into the Taj as we currently know it. But I'm not sure if it was the weather that compelled Shah Jahan to do it. I'm afraid only he can answer that.
The last question, I've been told that we're running out of time. So does anybody have a question? Anybody else? Okay, on that note, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to all our panelists.
Thank you.